Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. And I wanted to pick up on a few things that were said this morning. One was what Navina said about learning that death is a part of life. That really spoke to me. And also that it's very hard to ask for hospice care. And that kind of leads into this subject a little bit, because it's also very hard to talk about our funeral arrangements, right, and our burial. But what I find with people with whom I consult to do that once they talk about it and they learn about it and they explore the options, they feel empowered because it gives them more choices for what they want to do, just like with healthcare, right? The more you know, the more you can choose what's right for you. And so it's very uplifting. It's actually, they feel relieved afterwards. So I commend you for coming to this session to talk about funeral and burial and learn more so that you can take it back, both, I mean, really importantly for your personal lives, as well as if anybody asks you in your practice, you'll have more information to be able to tell them what's possible, instead of a go talk to your funeral director, which is a limited choice for them, because they're going to talk to them about what they do, not about the full gamut of choices, which is okay. We need them as professionals, and they I believe they want to educate people thoroughly, but there's more out there that people need to know to make a choice that's right for them. Because many of us are living our lives trying to be very environmentally conscious, and our current funeral and burial practices aren't often in sync with the choices that we're making for how we live. So that's why I'm here to speak to you, and I would like to take your questions during the session. It just makes it more interactive and more dynamic, and I get tired of hearing my own self speak. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I will call on you. If something's not clear, or if you want to elucidate on a point, I would be really happy for that to happen. And I want to get to all your questions. And I will say, I'm going to get to that in a second, just like Dr. Griggs. But another thing that Dr. Ehrig was saying was how many of you, I said, how many of you have, written your will or whatever. How many of you have actually talked about with your family what you want and made your funeral plans? Good. Wow, that's more hands up than I thought. So there's lots of reasons why we don't talk about end-of-life issues, right? We're not going to die. How many here aren't going to die? Or we've just gotten a diagnosis, and it's all about everything to stay alive, right? And when we don't talk about things, we end up just doing things like our family, especially in the funeral world, like our family has always done, which may not be in line with what we would have chosen if we'd known more. So without further ado, I'm going to start talking to you about home funeral and green burial. And I hope I've divided up the slides. There's a lot of photos, because I feel like photos speak really well to people about this, and people really crave being able to see those photos. And I want you to know that the families have all given permission for me to use their photos. In fact, after I've been with them and helped them with these choices, they've asked me to share them with other people, because it was such a meaningful, powerful experience for them. They said, please tell people about this, please use our photos. So that I will do. Oops. Okay, so this is actually a family photo from 1913. My father grew up in Petersburg, Michigan, down around near the Ohio border in the east part of Michigan. Anybody ever heard of that? No, it's down near, the city that he used to go to for like eye appointments and stuff. You've heard of it? Monroe or Adrian. And a very small town. In fact, he had to go do his senior year of high school in Detroit with his uncle in order to get into the University of Michigan Engineering School, because the high school wasn't accredited. So this was a cousin of his. My dad wasn't born yet, but he had this photo in his collection. And when I started doing this work after I retired from being a midwife, I recalled this photo because it's very hard to find photos like this. This is somebody laid out in the front parlor. So this is the way people used to do it in the culture that I come from, Midwest, European descent families cared for people at home when they were dying, like most people around the world still do today. And when they passed, somebody in the community would come over and help them lay out the body. It would be the midwife or a church lady or a neighbor or somebody like that. And they would have the visitation in the home and then proceed to the burial depending on the weather, within a day or 2 days or whatever. People lived close by, so they could get there, they could pay their respects, and it all proceeded at home. Anybody seen that in their own family? Yeah. As in small communities, people still remember when they were little, grandparents having done that. But we've basically lost the art of caring for our own dead. And we are, it's coming back. People are asking questions like, why don't we do it? Why can we do this like this anymore? So I'm here to tell you, you can. And this is what a modern home funeral could look like. I had an artist draw this picture for me. You see the person laid out on the couch, kids are present, the pet is there, there's probably food on the dining room table, people come pay their respects, and then within a day or 2 or 3, proceed for the burial or cremation. The decisions you make about how to care for the body between the death and the disposition is one set of decisions. We call that the funeral period. And then the decision about how to dispose of the body is a separate decision, and you can have one without the other. So you can have a home funeral and a conventional burial or cremation or green burial. You can have a green burial without having had a home funeral. So basically the definition is bringing the body home if the person did not die at home. I will tell you that most of the families that I have helped do this, and I've assisted close to 50 Michigan families now, the person has died at home in hospice care. And caring for the body at home after they've died at home in hospice is kind of a natural thing to do. Like, why do you need to hurry and take the body away? You don't. So if you remember one thing, remember that it's okay to be with the body. We just don't have models for that. And in fact, we have the opposite. We have a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of fear. And I think I have seen it be so helpful to the family in their grief to spend even just a little bit of time with the body after the death. My husband, whose mother died 3 years ago in a nursing home, spent 4 hours sitting with his mom's body and just praying and anointing her and crying and talking and just being present and being with his feelings, slowing the whole process down, taking a breath. Before then, we had a conventional funeral and burial. So all of these things people need to learn how to do, and that's what a home funeral guide does. But it's possible, and it's legal in all 50 states. And the most important thing is that the funeral is under the control of the family, which if you know anything about grief, when we can have some control over some things, it really helps us. How many of us want a job to do when we're grieving, right? And not having the body taken away too soon. I've never heard anybody say that they wish they didn't have time with the body. I've only ever heard people say they wish they had more time. So the first thing is don't do anything. When someone dies at home in hospice care, I advise families to call the hospice nurse, but just be there, be with what's happening. Give ourselves permission to care. Then after that, within a timely fashion, a few hours or so, you want to move into washing the body, cleaning any soiled linens, garments, underwear, and laying the person out fresh and clean, which is just a universal desire to do, to clean up and lay the person out in a beautiful way, so that then you widen the circle. After this initial period of washing and dressing and cooling, we use dry ice. And I teach workshops on how to do this, but it's very simple. You can learn online how to do it. Just a few pieces of small pieces of dry ice need to go under the body, under the torso mainly, and that cools the torso, cools the body right down. It needs to get down to about 70 degrees, and it works very efficiently. And you just check it. It takes 12 to 24 hours to evaporate, and you replenish it for the duration of the time you're going to be at home. And it works very, very well. And lay the person out, decorate the room, adorn them with mementos, with special objects, religious icons, photos, things that they have made, even quilts or bed linens that were important to them. And then you can invite other people in to have, to widen the circle to the more public sphere of beginning the morning in a more public way. So that's just a picture of how some people in different cultures have done it in terms of decorating and adorning, which gives people a lot of choice, right? You're not trying to take things to the funeral home to do that, and try to make the funeral home home-like. It's your own home where you can more easily do that. So the decisions that people need to make are how large they want this gathering to be. I've worked with families that have had a large home and have opened up their home for like a visiting hours time period, and they've had up to 200 people come through the home over the course of a couple of days. I've worked with families where there was 3 people, the daughter, the son, and one of their partners, just for like 12 hours or whatever. So the choices are myriad. Anybody can do whatever they need to do for their community and for their family. We call it home funeral for the reasons I already mentioned, but really not everybody has, a funeral implies a service, right? Like a religious service or ceremony or ritual. Not everybody does that. One family I worked with had the Threshold Choir come and sing. Who's heard of Threshold Choir? Threshold Choir is a national organization that has groups wherever anybody wants to start one. There's one in Ann Arbor, there's one in Detroit, and they sing at the bedside of the dying person, and they're trained just some cursory training in how to be appropriate in that setting, and they practice their music, which is very simple. And this family had the Threshold Choir. They usually send 2 or 3 people at a time to a home. Before the person had died, they wanted to bring them back in after the person died, and that ended up being kind of like the funeral for them, because it just lent some formality to it, where there was a focus, an outward focus, which is what people usually need to do, is to be in touch with the larger connection of life and death, of what's going on here when someone dies. And other people have had a clergy person come into the home. Other people have made up their own kind of ceremony or whatever, but this allows people to be able to do whatever it is they need to do, which is right for them. I've helped people design a simple little ceremony. Anybody can really do that. When people have very strong religious connection or ideas about what should happen at that point, they know what they need. So I don't have to be the expert on different religions, because they know what they need, and they know who to ask. The more important it is to them, the more they're able to do it for themselves. But there are a lot of people who don't have any connection to any formal spiritual care and are making things up, and a few simple guidelines can help them do that. And then they may need to make just so you know, the difference between a funeral and a memorial is the funeral of the body is present, the memorial of the body is not present. Maybe the ashes are there, or maybe not. And then for disposition, the standard choices are cremation, or conventional burial, or natural burial, green burial. There are other choices out there. Has anybody heard of the pods that you can like bury me and plant a tree kind of thing? And there's other things, burial at sea. I know people in California who do burial at sea, and they go like 6 miles off the coast, and the body is weighted and dropped down to the bottom of the ocean, like a mile down or some great distance. And then there's promession, which is, or alkaline hydrolysis, which is getting some media attention. I think all of those things are going to continue to develop and raise awareness about the different options that are out there. I still think that our main choices are going to be burial or cremation for a lot of practical reasons. And the thing about the pod burial is that you still have to be cremated and placed in that pod, and then where can you plant this pod that's going to grow a tree? Because trees have roots, and it can't be in a standard, plot in a cemetery, because you can't, like I've gone back to the cemetery in Petersburg where my dad's mom is buried, and found out that he can't be buried there anymore, even though he owned the plot next door, because there's a large tree there now, and we're talking, it's been 80 years. So, yeah, those are the main choices. But A lot of people are becoming more aware about the toxic effects of formaldehyde-based embalming fluids and not wanting to do embalming, plus they're aware of how invasive that is to the body, and they're not wanting to pay for it. They're wanting to do things more simply, so a lot of people are not wanting to embalm, and very many people think that if they don't embalm, their only choice is to cremate without seeing the body, like a direct cremation. So have you worked with families who've had the body taken directly from the place of death, the hospital or nursing home or whatever, to a direct cremation where no one got to see the body? And I think that's great, that the more choices we have, the better, but I do think for a lot of people, it's so beneficial to be able to view the body. And that's what's lost in that. So that's not your only option. Very many funeral homes will not do a public viewing without embalming. Why do you think that is?
Disease.
Yeah, fear of disease. Mm-hmm. What, any other reasons?
Statute, isn't it? Or
Excuse me?
I think a lot of funeral homes say it's a statute.
Yeah, mm-hmm. They tell you it's the only legal option, yep. Not true for either one of those. You can't get diseases from a dead body. I mean, there's a few out there, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease and massive, sepsis, septicemia, but by and large, the things that people die of, the disease organisms, the bacteria die with the body, right? So, especially if you're cooling the body, right away and getting it down to 70 degrees, there's no risk of disease. Well, the other big reason I think is just, this is what we've come to expect. How many of you have gone to a funeral with an open casket and a viewing, and that's what you hear is, oh, they look so good. And that's what we have come to expect as the way you do funerals. Is like we make them look lifelike. So we'll have this life-like memory picture, it's called, right? Again, I think that option should be there for those people for whom that's really important. But for me, I just, when I saw my grandfather a few hours before he died, and the next time I saw him was in the casket embalmed, I was looking for some comfort when I went to the funeral to see him, to say goodbye, and I'm like, whoa, that's not my grandfather, So that when the next person in my family died, I said, I want to see the body before they do that, because I need to be in touch with what the body really looks like when it dies. So when my aunt died, my mom called me and I said, don't let them take her body till I get there. And luckily I was only a half hour away, and I was able to get to the nursing home and just sit with her, with my mom and my grandmother, and just be with her body. And this is way before I had educated myself or known anything about how to help people do this, and I was afraid to touch her body. My inclination was to want to do that. I just wanted to caress her. I just wanted to touch her, and I was afraid. I was a nurse at this point. I had worked on, what was I afraid of? I don't know. It was just something so deep that, fears, they don't make sense a lot of the time. Or they're not based on, facts or whatever. So I turned to my mother and my grandmother, and my grandmother she was born in 1903, she must have seen bodies laid out, in her childhood, but she couldn't guide me either. My mom and I have talked about that a lot since then, and she's like, I'm sorry I failed you. I'm like, Mom, where would you have gotten the knowledge? She was raised in Detroit. No one had home funerals, when she was coming up. So this is something you can help people with. It's like, it's okay. How many of you have heard stories of people getting in bed with the person? Yeah. Raise your hand. Yeah. Wake up, raise your hand.
Are there ocean laws though in nursing homes that the body has to be removed after a certain period of time? Because I know in the hospital,
it's not a state law.
It's only 2 hours that we can allow patients
Yeah.
to do it before
The state laws are very minimal, but all institutions have their own policies. So, for instance, in hospitals, I've heard beautiful stories of them allowing the family time to be with the body, and I've heard other stories where they say we have to take the body right away. I think it's more based on needing the room and not having the available space for the family to be there than anything else. And also, nursing homes and hospitals will not allow the family, they will not release the body into the care of the family. Why do you think that is? Anybody seen Little Miss Sunshine? You don't want limbs falling out, people trying to awkwardly carry. What? It is a great movie, yeah. Families, they've never done this before. They don't know how to do it. You don't want awkward things happening, fear, injury, discretion, all those things. but there's no state law against it. It's just the institutional policy. Yeah. Yep.
I have a question. For a hospice patient, you know, if they have a major fall, recorded passing, may require an autopsy. If the family wanted to do a home burial, how does that work with requiring an autopsy?
Okay, so I'm going to pick on you just a little bit because you just said something that I want to let people know. You included, doesn't it diss on you? Home burial is not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about home funeral, and it's two different decisions. So it's important to start using that language, home funeral, and then whatever burial you choose. So, okay, so your question was about when an autopsy is needed?
Yeah.
When someone doesn't die in hospice care, it's entirely different. I would, all but, I don't know, 2 of the 50 families I've worked with, they've all died in hospice care. It's very different. When someone is not in hospice care, well, first of all, when someone's in hospice care, the death is registered already with the county, the authorities, and it's expected. And depending on, in Michigan, anybody not from Michigan, in Michigan, depending on which county in hospice, you either have to call the police or not, right? Some of the larger cities require that you call the police, and the police, you know, you tell them this is a hospice death, and they're like, okay, we got to come, you know, we know this is a formality, and they come and they're very nice about it, and they say, yeah, you know, we're really sorry for your loss, and I don't see any foul play, so we're going to go now, you know, but because the hospice personnel are trained, I was a hospice nurse and I had to go to the morgue in Detroit and learn how to tell if there was a foul play, you know, if there was, you know, petechiae from suffocation or, you know, whatever. So, so the hospice nurse can certify the death. And that's another thing that it's helpful for families to know, is that even though they were sitting at the bedside and they know when mom died, it was 11:51 and the nurse doesn't get there till, you know, 12:30, that's what's going to go on the death certificate when the nurse listens to the heart and lungs. And it's helpful for families to know that, especially if it's a date change. So autopsies are not required in hospice. We know that. So when someone dies not in hospice care, even if they're elderly, just seen the doctor, we know they're on their way, you know, it's not a surprise, the family is prepared and ready, they're caring for them, they still have to call the police. It's called an unattended death. And in order to generate the paperwork for the death certificate, which hospice does, if you're not in hospice, you know, doctors don't usually come to the home, they don't carry, you know, they don't know how to do the paperwork, the registration for the death certificate or whatever, so you have to call the police. And most often that means the body's going to have to go to the medical examiner for examination. The family can oppose an autopsy on religious reasons, but they need to know that they can do that and be empowered to say that. So if an autopsy has been done to determine the cause of death, and you know, I've heard of stories where the family doctor got involved, they'd just seen the person, the funeral director came, everybody talked it over, there was enough resources and you know, no profiling going on, and that didn't have to happen. The body could stay at home, but it's rare. So after an autopsy, they don't really repair the body after an autopsy. So that's when you need to involve a funeral director. And then you can take the body home. It probably will have embalming though. So it's a modified home funeral, a blended home funeral, if you will. Yeah, it's still possible. Same thing with organ donation or tissue donation or anything else, donation, whole body donation. Those are the 3 main kinds of donation, depending on the type and the timing. And, you know, I've known a family that was going to donate the cornea, so they just had to leave an ice pack over the eyes while they had the home funeral or whatever. You can do the donation and then bring the body home with assistance. Yeah. So all those things are possible. The family just needs to know to break through the standard. This is what we tell people, and here's what you got to do, and here's what we're familiar with. Hopefully you find somebody who's willing to explore that with you or listen or bring in a funeral director that's helpful. Yeah, not all of them are So planning ahead is essential. I've gotten calls from people where, from the hospital, my aunt just died and I heard about this thing called home funeral and, can you tell me a little bit about it? I'm like, yes, but are you the main decision maker? No, it's my sister. And I'm like, well, does your sister want to have a home funeral? And if that's not, if not everybody else is on board, it's not going to happen. It requires cohesion in the family, right? A family having said that, did talk to a family where the father died. There was 3 siblings that were highly functional, all in agreement. I talked to them on the phone for like 30 minutes or less, and they did everything on their own with no further input from me. They were so empowered to do it. So it's possible, but you need to have time to ask those questions. It sounds so weird still to most people. You want a what? Isn't that kind of Friday the 13th, And so you need time to talk about it and soothe everybody and figure out what's right for the whole family. It's not just one person doing this usually. And then learning how to care for the body. And again, you can learn online, or you can have somebody like me, a home funeral guide, consult with the family. I don't make myself available anymore to be there at the time of the death. When I was first learning, I did, because I needed to learn too, but now I just give people all the information they need to be able to do it on their own. Yes?
In your experience, what is driving the desire for a home funeral?
Good question. Yeah.
What your experience has been?
I think, I also do Death Cafe, by the way. I've been doing that for 6 years. And
Dead to show up?
no. And in fact, it's about living. I just want to correct you. Any misconceptions about what Death Cafe is? It's about living life to the fullest. But I think a lot of people are dissatisfied with a lot of things about how we do death in our culture, and they're wanting to change that. And I think it's kind of a throwback to the old ways, kind of. I call this traditional, even though, and I call the way we do things these days conventional, not traditional. People are wanting to have a little more control. They don't want to pay a lot of money. That's not the primary reason. It can't be, really. That's a negative motivator. You have to really want to do it and to take charge and to educate yourself. Wanting to spend time with the body in a natural setting. I think it's a real natural progression from caring for somebody at home when they're dying. Don't you?
Jewish faith.
Yeah.
So it's different.
Yeah.
And so spending time with the body maybe immediately after death might occur because they might be there at the time. Traditionally, burial occurs
within a day.
Within 48 hours.
Yeah.
This is a holiday or something that dictates differently. And oftentimes, and the body cannot be left alone.
Right.
So there are people that will prepare the body for burial.
Right. And there's women for a woman and men for a man,
Yes,
and they pray.
Ritual and so forth.
It's beautiful.
Preparing the body for burial.
Yeah.
It's not in clothing, and in fact, there is no public viewing of the body
Right.
at the funeral.
Yeah.
The casket may be there with the
Yeah.
body, but it's not something that's viewed.
Yeah.
So it's different. And even the immediate family may not, oftentimes, off to the side, they may have a chance to view the body. So there is a difference. That's, I
Yeah.
mean, for you, you may not experience that because it may be something that's handled by the hospice staff.
Well, I have actually, but it's been a modified approach to accommodate the needs of the faith. I haven't personally been there, but I've heard.
So it's interesting because I would imagine that I have not been to a home funeral for somebody who's Jewish. The funeral typically is public, and then there's the home, what's called the shiva, which is 7 days of mourning.
Yeah.
It's
I had
different.
I had someone of the Jewish faith call me and ask me when his wife was dying in hospice, and he said, we're Jewish and we're not going to do the whole Jewish thing, but I just want to know, can I wash your body? Because that was the part of the ritual that spoke to him or spoke to her that she had asked for. And the beauty of it is you can do whatever gives you meaning. A very dear friend of mine named Merilynne Anderson wrote a book called Sacred Dying. She wrote it from a Christian perspective, but it's not just for Christians. She herself is dying right now. I'm very sad to say, but I borrow her term, and she says, giving whatever gives you meaning, and I hang on those words to empower people to think about that. And I would ask you all to do that too. What will give you meaning in caring for a loved one or what you would want for yourself. And then knowing that's possible.
Yeah, just on a related note to all of this, there was just an article, I think yesterday or the day before in the New York Times about a new device that's called the cuddle cot. Have you heard of this?
Yeah.
It's a cooling incubator when parents have a stillbirth or a baby that dies. It allows them over the course of like 4 or 5 days to be with their child, to take pictures and have other family members come and say hello and goodbye. And
Yeah.
I think it's so interesting that that's like this is so not technology, and yet we're using technology to enable the same ability.
Yeah. That could be so much easier than having to get dry ice, you know.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I do want to tell you about something called the 48-hour rule. Anybody ever heard of that before? So there's this 48-hour rule that funeral directors will use, and the rule says that you have to bury, embalm, or cremate within 48 hours after death. What it doesn't say is it doesn't talk about cooling, and we all know that cooling is used as well. You know, I mean, there's lots of bodies in morgues that have been there for months, right? Or funeral directors will cool the body in their own facility until it's, you know, they go to the crematory and it's well after 48 hours. So cooling should be in there, and when you're having a home funeral, you are cooling the body. I mean, that's what people have to learn how to do if they're going to have a home funeral. It's very important to do that, to start doing that soon after death. That often when people are prospectively trying to find a funeral director, they'll often have that used as a means to say no, because there's the 48-hour rule, or it has to be, you can only have up to 48 hours. Well, I've never had a family who had the body at home and was working with the funeral director who was progressing towards getting to the burial or so within 3 days or so, have a funeral director in the moment when their client use that against them. They've been, very flexible because, they are in their own practices all the time. So prospectively going and talking to somebody, they may say that, and then I just usually say, well, I don't think that's going to be an issue, so thank you. And, and then in the moment, it's not so much of an issue, because I think their big concern is they don't want to work with somebody who's like, oh, we're going to do this for a week, and they don't want to make promises, ahead of time. So in the moment, when families have called a funeral director and said, my daughter just died, this happened to a family in Dearborn, we, working with the home funeral guide, we've washed her and dressed her and cooled her body. We'll call you tomorrow morning, but we want to have her at home for a few days. And they're like, oh, that might be an issue. And I'm like, well, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. Okay, they go in and start making all the plans, right? And the ball gets rolling, and it's fine. So I just want you to know that if you were to go and talk to your friend, the funeral director, you might get that response. Yeah.
So for me, all of this is very foreign. This whole embalming thing and visitations and a funeral a week out from the dead, because it's very different in my culture and my religion. But the reason why I'm here is because I work with a hospice, and I've had a couple of patients who have wanted what they call green funerals. I mean, to me, that's normal. That's what you do. That's how you bury your body. You wherever you are, if the person dies in the hospital, the family takes them home. They wash them. They wrap them. People come to the house. So you do everything at home. The few patients who asked about the green funeral because of cost. That apparently it costs a lot less. Can you speak a little bit to that about the cost of a regular funeral and a green funeral?
Yeah.
And then maybe something about somebody who's not thought about having a green funeral, how to approach them.
Yes.
Like especially when you know that they have problems paying for it.
So let's talk about the law in Michigan. Michigan is one of the more restrictive states. In 41 or 40 states now, the family can do everything on their own. They do not need to involve a funeral director at all. They do have to, wait in line at the county and file the death certificate themselves and, all that stuff. But if they are motivated to do that, they can. In Michigan, you must work with a funeral director because Michigan law states that a funeral director has to sign the death certificate in addition to the doctor. And then most funeral directors, if they're signing something, their name's on it, they feel responsible. They want, they want to be more involved than just signing it. So the other law that affects this is that a funeral director has to sign the transit permit for final disposition. That goes on. Both of those go on file with the county, so the county knows where the body is disposed of, whether it's either a crematory or a cemetery that gets listed there. So first and foremost, you have to find a funeral director who's going to work with you. And, it takes a lot of diplomacy to do that. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is cost. So, taking the body home and not embalming and not paying for a visitation in a funeral home and their services and all that stuff is incredibly much cheaper. The only thing you're paying for is whether it's a plot that you're purchasing in a cemetery and whatever the cemetery requires for the burial or the cremation itself, the direct cremation. There is an organization in the Detroit area that will do a direct cremation from the home after a home funeral for $700. Then I've known of funeral homes that will charge $3,500 for essentially the same thing. So there's not a lot of, people need to know how to ask the questions and how to shop around. And so that's the part of the preparation that there needs to be a lot of education going so people even know what questions to ask, and there needs to be some organization to that. So it's really hard to compare those things because, you're not just saying it's home funeral or green burial or the whole conventional method because there's a whole bunch of things on that price list, but that gives you a start with something to work with, I hope.
You still have to get a funeral director.
Correct.
So they're still going to charge for that service.
Well, some will and some won't. So there's this one organization that does it because they really want to make a low-cost alternative for people in the Detroit area, and they charge $700. So they're not getting they're not doing a lot of hand-holding along with that, right? There's not a lot of fluff associated with that. It's just like we pick up the body and we take it, Other funeral directors is like, well, we have all these overhead costs and you're going to, pay us to be on call for you or, whatever. It's very variable. Just a few pictures from other home funeral guides around the country and what people have done. Personal expression is the operative word here. What it looks like to be laid out in a shroud. It's totally doable if you have a cemetery that allows for green burial to be buried in a shroud. A shroud can be made out of anything. You can purchase a very fancy one online with, imported fabric or whatever. You can make one out of a couple of bed sheets or other fabric. One woman I knew told me she was in hospice and none of her family would talk to her about this, and she called me in to consult with her. She said, I really want somebody to know what I want because my family, if I talk about this, they say I'm giving up and they don't want to hear it. So we talked for an hour and wrote down everything she wanted, and she said she wanted to be buried in a shroud. When she died, that hospice called me because they knew that I knew something about green burial. They didn't know I had talked with her. And I said, it wouldn't happen to be so-and-so, would it? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, well, we talked. I know what she wants. And her family was there, her husband and her son. And I asked if they wanted me to come in, and they said yes. And so I went there. And the first thing I did, they were kind of sitting in the corner, and they were pretty shocked. She'd been playing music with them the night before. And she died in the wee hours of the morning, and they got called in and they were just so distraught. And I went right up to her and I touched her and I talked to her and I caressed her. And in so doing, I was modeling for the 18-year-old son that it was okay to do that. He jumped out of that chair and came right over and started interacting. And he said, we got to put a hat on. Her mom always wore hats. And so I said, do you know where her hats are? And he's like, yeah, they're right here. And he put it on. That kid ended up leading the charge. He ended up, there's a photo, a couple of photos here. He ended up being the one who gave the eulogy, who was the first to help start filling in the grave after the green burial. But what I did for her, because there wasn't any preparations, I just went out and bought 8 yards of gold fabric because I'd seen this photo. And with the funeral director, we just figured out how to wrap her up, and now he does this all the time for other families. This guy, I went out to Montana and did a home funeral workshop, and this guy had designed his own funeral. He was an artist, and that's what it looked like with the little places for the dry ice to go underneath, like the false bottom. He's in there. His wife's hand is on his head, and that's his mom. That's his doll from his childhood. As each person came to the home for the visitation, the home funeral, whatever, there was flowers all around in pots, and they asked people to take them and put them in the casket. He also was a potter, and they had wet clay, and people made their handprints and put it on the casket. And then this family took his body in a pickup truck to the crematory with a New Orleans-style brass band, frontlining, is that what you call it? Frontline? No, not frontlining, that's a drug term, isn't it? I don't know, whatever it's called, marching, singing, whatever. And he was cremated in that casket. Laying out the decorating supplies, this is what it looks like. So this is a cardboard cremation casket. It's like $25, $35 supplied by the funeral director. And also another expression for people to decorate. I had a family who took the lid of the casket to the kid's school when the kid died, and all the classmates put, pictures and sayings and stuff on there so that they could be involved. This was a way to express your grief. This is what people need.
Does anybody ever do it before they die?
Yes. I'm working with a woman right now. She's 93 years old. She had a shroud made for her, and she had a party, and everybody came over and signed her shroud. And Merilynne, you got to come over and sign my shroud. I finally did. And every time I go visit her, she's like, you want to see my shroud? I'm like, I've seen it, Lois.
So not to distract you from what you're talking about, but there comes a point where you start thinking about what parts can you control. So you're talking about it from the family, from the bereaved perspectives, but in fact, during
the dying person,
actually taking some control of that. So it's not just the funeral arrangement. It's like, hey, listen, I want to be in this type of box. Or
right.
I want my casket decorated or by these people or whoever it may be. Or taking it a step further, which sounds morbid, writing
not to me.
Eulogy.
Yeah, a lot of people do that.
When you go to a funeral, people talk about somebody, when in fact they sometimes don't hear from the person who in fact is sitting or lying there in front. So.
A priest at my church had his whole eulogy written out, and his obit written out so that it was just read. Then you're really saying what somebody wanted to be said, right? It's like doing your advance directives. If you do them properly, no one has to make decisions for you. You've already made them. They're just enacting them, There was a beautiful article in the New York Times. I regret that I didn't save the link to about a guy about 5 years ago, about a guy who was dying of cancer and the relationship with this acquaintance of his that was a carpenter, that they ended up getting together over a few months to build this casket together, and what happened during that time, the time they spent together, and the carpenter was the one that wrote the article after the guy died about how special, what a privilege that was to be able to the only thing I can relate to is making a scrapbook for my daughter when she got married. It's like that times 1,000 or something. Yeah. So this woman, this is she after she died, a couple days after she died, laid out in her bedroom where she died. They arranged the room with photos, and people often ask me, what does it look like? In fact, one of the families, the 4-year-old who died, or 5-year-old who died, they were going to have an open casket mass at the church, and the church was really worried about it because they heard that she wasn't embalmed, and it was 3 days after she died. And they asked me, they said, is there an odor? And I was like, oh, poor. I said, bless your heart. You don't have anybody else to ask about. Oops, that's the mic, sorry. I was touching the mic. This is a very common question because we don't have knowledge and education and opportunities to learn about this anymore. Since we've taken care out of the realm of the family, the locus of control, And then the next thing they wanted to know was, what does she look like? So this is 2 days after she died, with just a little bit of makeup, combing her hair. I mean, the lips get a little blue, the nail beds get a little blue, the stomach sinks in. But every family has told me how beautiful the person looked. And then they eat and talk. In all cultures, that's what we do. This woman died at her daughter's house. It was really hard to get her into hospice. She got there and died an hour and 10 minutes later, with their daughter and her grandchildren at her side. This is the funeral director helping carry her body downstairs after a 2-day visitation upstairs. And the kids taking their cues from the adults, who were perfectly fine with it, were fine with it. Notice her mouth is open. A lot of people ask me about that. There are ways to get the mouth to stay shut. It's probably the hardest part, because the jaw just naturally, and when I ask them, you want me to, wrap some Curl-X around her chin to get it to stay shut overnight, and then it'll stay shut, and they're like, no, she slept that way, we're used to it, it's fine. Don't mess with it. The daughter did not want, this is doing the paperwork with the art supplies with the funeral director, the son and the daughter. The daughter did not want the lid to go in the casket. They went to the crematory, and she wanted this last ride for her to not have the lid on. It just felt too final before she was ready. The daughter and the son pushed her casket into the retort. And prior to that, we had sung some songs and done some readings. And that was the funeral for the kids. They weren't religious. There was a memorial service later for the mom's family or friends. The 4-year-old daughter chose to go to the crematory with mom and dad. The 7-year-old son chose to stay back with grandpa. And that's what I tell people, like, let the kids decide. Give them choices. Kids know what they can handle, and that's what he needed to do. At age 7, that's a really open window of time to be very open about contemplating the big things, what is life, what is death, what is God, what happens. And it was just all a little too much for him after he wanted to stay home. So, yeah, in case I hadn't gotten to that topic yet, this is my reminder. Any other questions about that? I mean, the cost is a lot, that was like 8,000 to 10,000 was like from the Funeral Consumers Alliance, I think in 2014 or something. It's gone, I mean, you can spend $25,000 on a funeral. So this is the first photo essay from the first home funeral that I ever attended. Sharon was 64. This is her last birthday. She had 3 children and 2 grandchildren. And she died in the home of her daughter Laura on the right. And Laura has since died of cancer as well. She was a very good friend of mine. And in fact helped me when I was on call in the early days of doing this. This is Sharon at home in hospice care in her daughter's apartment. This was her marriage bed, which she had brought into the apartment that she wanted to die in. They had had a very tumultuous relationship, mental illness involved, the way the death happened, the caring at the end, and the home funeral was very healing for them. So the kids were used to coming over, spent a lot of time there. And after she died, they called me, and I went over, and after an hour or so, first we just talked, just what people want to do is just talk about what happened, how it happened. So we just talked, and then we moved into washing her body and dressing her. And the next morning the kids came, and they went right up to the bed because they were used to doing that, and they touched their grandma, and their mom was right there to ease that for them and give them age-appropriate answers to why is she cold, why is she stiff. And then they played with the dog and made little notes for grandma and stuff, and then they came back, and then they touched her, and they got in bed with her, and then they went and played. I mean, I don't think these kids are going to grow up with the fear of being around a dead body that I had. They decorated the casket. There's the Bible on the bed. And they decorated the room. Some of the notes. And then when the funeral director came, to take the body. It was she died on a Monday night. It was Thursday morning. On Wednesday, and I talked to the daughters about, that they had the option to go to the crematory with the body if they wanted. They were like, we can't even think about that. We can't even think about this ending. We were not there. But on the morning of the third day, the daughter said to me, it's time. It's very clear to me now, looking at her body, that her spirit is no longer here. And we don't need this vessel anymore. It's very common to have that kind of third day. Sound familiar? Some people. So their anthroposophists believe that it takes up to 3 days for the spirit to fully leave the body, and that you need to vigil with the body during that time. It has to be there. So they went to the crematory, and they were there pushing her body into the retort, and they pushed the button, in fact, to start the cremation. And then we went back out into the November sunshine after that, and the daughter said to me, that was incredibly hard. But I'm relieved because I know what happened to her body every step of the way. I was there. I cared for her, and I have no regrets. That says it all to me. Frank died 5 years to the day after that first home funeral, and this is before he died. His granddaughters from New York were here. One of the granddaughters was very upset about the idea of her mom having a home funeral for her grandpa. She just couldn't get it, and was like worried her mom was falling off the deep end. And afterwards, some real healing took place. So the granddaughter ended up having some very good healing moments with her mom at the bedside with her grandpa during the home funeral. And she was a journalist for a magazine in New York, and she ended up writing a very beautiful article about it that's on my website. So she completely changed her mind about that. So he died in a nursing home in hospice care, and this is them waiting for the funeral director to get there to take him home. So they're washing him and dressing him, the daughter and her husband. And then the funeral director came, and this is at the home, laying him out in the bed at home. And he was a World War II veteran, a pilot, so they had photos of his life, and they had a visitation at the home. And then you could see the little dry ice wrapped in little cloths there on the bed under the body, where the body was. That's all that's needed. And this is what's called a church cart, this dolly with wheels that goes up and down and can get the body out of the house. And they went through the funeral door. Homes used to be built with parlors that a lot of them had a door for direct egress, so they didn't have to worry about going around corners and things like that. And it was really important to the daughter to use that. Even though they didn't lay them out in the parlor like they used to do in the old days, she wanted to go through the parlor and out the funeral door to outside where he was a barbershop quartet singer, and they put his hat in there, and they sang some hymns and stuff. And then the funeral director took his body to the cemetery in Springfield, Illinois for a military burial. And they went along. So I think we covered most of this. Yeah. But it's the concept of, a lot of people think that it's common practice, and they're led to believe that that's because it's a law, but it's not. There's actually very few restrictive laws about it. And I think we covered most of this. No family has ever told me it was distressing. In fact, the opposite. If you already made arrangements, a lot of our parents have done that, you can get 95% of your money back before you die. After you die, you cannot. So I tell people to pre-plan but not prepay. You never know where you're going to end up, and it's really hard. You can't get your money back, especially with cemetery plots.
Did you just have a question about law and state lines?
State lines, yes. If you can cross state lines, but you can't, if the body has to be embalmed if you're using common carrier like UPS or airlines.
They make the special carriers for cars, is what I've been told, too. Do they have to be involved to be in one of those carriers?
Nope, doesn't matter what they're in, it's more who's doing the transport. Yeah. Any other questions with that? Michigan passed a law 2 years ago where you can designate a funeral representative. This is especially great for LGBTQ same-sex couples or people who are not legally married, you don't have to contact the next of kin to give permission for cremation if you've designated a funeral representative, and that's just a form that you notarize.
Or people with feuding multiple children.
Yeah, you can designate a friend, yeah. And then your kids don't have to fight. Yeah, yeah, yes.
Otherwise, with cremation, you need to get
the majority. So if you have 3 kids, you have to get 2 of them. If you have 2 kids, you have to get 2 of them. If you have 5 kids, you have to get 3 of them. If you have 6 kids, you have to get 4 of them. You have to have a majority signatures for cremation. But if you designate a funeral representative, it's one person that you talk this all over with.
I think they just made a change in that now needs to be notarized.
It does have to be notarized. It always has, yeah. I mean, it's been 2 years. It happened in 2016. So just really quickly for you medical people or anybody who wants to know, be very careful with any of these issues. If someone wants to have a home funeral, I would involve a funeral director perhaps if you were worried about anything. And I put family issues at the top of the list. Dealing with a family that's not cohesive or is not harmonious can be a risk factor. And sudden death, trauma, breakdown of the skin is a huge issue. But absolutely can't not do a home funeral with septicemia, CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, gangrene, or buildup of tissue gas. But when we're dealing with people who have died gradually, all these things are mute. You know, there's time to prepare. They're not eating right before they die. That's what, you know, builds up bacteria and the bloating and purging and all of that. You don't have those issues if somebody hasn't been eating or drinking for days, right? So it's a very natural progression, and it's very low risk. There's a national organization called the Home Funeral Alliance that has tons of really great information on their website. So I'll just refer you to that for further education and questions. Lots of booklets to download, connections in every state, and if you have family elsewhere that wants to know about this, you can find a home funeral guide there. All right, I'm going to move on and talk about green burial in the remaining time that we have. Oh shoot, there it is. Okay.
Have you noticed a trend? You asked, when you started your talk, you asked how many of us have, have made funeral arrangements. Do you find that, for instance, mixed families or second and third marriages result in either conflict or inability to address this because there's diverging opinions and needs? So, the guy who's married to his third wife but dies, says, I want to really be married to my first.
I'm dealing with that with my father right now because he's got a wife and her family and us and
more or less.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. I'd love to have a funded study on that, but I will say that families don't get along any better under crisis like death. So if there's issues for whatever reason, whether it's blended family or just whatever, it's not going to get any easier. They're not going to suddenly, because there's a crisis or somebody just died, find it easier to talk to each other and get along. No, it's going to be tons harder. That's just going to happen, right? And I've seen families that did really well with that. I think it's just more their coping skills, whatever their circumstances, not so much the makeup of their family. Yeah, interesting question. So basically so it's not green funeral, right? We're all sure about that, right? It's home funeral and green burial. You can have one without the other. So let's move on and talk about green burial, the other choice that somebody could make, not having had a home funeral or whatever. It basically means you're not polluting things in the earth. And there's only 10 cemeteries in Michigan right now that allow for the body to go in the ground without the use of a concrete grave liner. And why do they say they need a concrete grave liner? Why do you think they think it's necessary? Money, yes. What else?
Grave robbing.
Grave robbing was the reason that, thank you for saying that. That's why they were invented in the first place. And they used to be made out of steel and locked and everything, yes. And that's why we have a graveyard shift, because people would stay overnight in the graveyard they would hire people to watch the grave so no one would steal the body. What were you going to offer?
The graves caving in eventually?
Yes, that's the big thing. It's about how you maintain the grounds. So cemeteries and golf courses are among, other than monocropping, are among the most toxic utilization of land that we have, or the way that it's treated. So we have a certain way we expect cemeteries to look, which is no weeds, mown green lawns and everything, just perfect. And that takes a lot of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, and you don't want the ground will sink in when you bury, as the contents decompose, whether it's a cardboard box or usually you don't use cardboard, a plain pine box or a wicker basket some people are using or whatever, you have to mound up the ground and go back and do more maintenance later, because you don't want people stepping on it and having that be when it caves in, or riding your heavy equipment over it, your front hoe or your lawnmower or whatever. So basically we have these cement cities under the ground so that the ground will stay level. And so cemeteries, and also you can have smaller plots if you're using the concrete, because it's much harder to make a mistake and accidentally dig into the next grave. So green burial plot needs to be larger so you don't accidentally, disturb a body. So other than that, those are the three basic elements. There's a lot of variation from one cemetery to the next. All the cemeteries in Michigan that allow for natural burial are what's called hybrid cemeteries. They are conventional cemeteries that have a section for green burial. The most pretty one is in Waterford, the All Saints, the Preserve at All Saints Cemetery. It's a Catholic cemetery, however, and you have to be Catholic or Christian to be buried there. They have a whole big conservation area. In other states, there's probably 20 to 30 in the country now where there's a whole cemetery that's dedicated just to conservation measures and returning the land to natural uses. So the concern is that concrete is extremely toxic to make. Does more damage to the environment than the aviation industry in terms of damaging the ozone. And we're filling our earth with cement, which does not biodegrade, and imported woods with unnatural resins and paints and steel and fixtures and stuff. And then the formalin itself that's used for embalming doesn't actually cause problems once it becomes inert. I mean, when it breaks down, it becomes inert and it's not toxic, but it's toxic to the funeral workers who are doing the embalming. That's the concern there. And then we talked about all the pesticides and herbicides and all of that. So this is the first green cemetery I ever visited. Does that look like a cemetery to you? The bodies are buried there. That's in fact a grave getting ready for a burial, and they have pine boughs mounded up on the side because Michigan, Ohio, we get a lot of water. As soon as you dig the grave, it starts, filling in with water. So you put pine boughs on the bottom. It's just a lot more comforting to be not seeing the body go into water. It's going onto these nice, gentle pine boughs instead. But this is a conservation cemetery attached to a nature center, and so they're doing a lot of restoration work. This used to be monocropped farmland, which is now being planted with native grasses, and they do controlled burn, I think, but no weed whacking and mowing and all of that. That is also a cemetery. What do you think? You want to be buried in something like that? It's comfort. It's pretty to me. I don't mind that my family couldn't go to the actual site, the plot, and stand on it and say, this is where my body, like to be buried out there somewhere in a beautiful setting is good enough for me, but not everybody thinks that. And different cemeteries have different rules about that, what they allow.
Must a body be buried in a cemetery? Is it a rule that you allow you have to be buried in a cemetery?
Yes. You have to be buried in a land that's set off as a cemetery, yeah. It has to, Yep, go on file with the county where the body is. You have to be able to locate the body. So even in these places that look very natural, there's GPS markers or there's a grid that they've established where they know where everybody is. But that is one of the drawbacks that you have to hire, it's not hard to find. So if you want to find the exact spot, you have to get somebody to take you there.
Is that only in Michigan?
No, it's everywhere. You have to be buried in a cemetery. Well, it varies. In Montana, you can bury somebody on your property, big old farmland, and you don't have to designate it, have it deeded as a cemetery. But if you bury somebody else there, if you have two bodies, then it has to be a cemetery. In Michigan, for the first burial on your property, you have to deed it as a cemetery, which you can do if you live outside the city, and there's rules about that, and you have to have it, you have to hire a lawyer and plot it out. And you can bury in your backyard, but it's hard. You have to plan way ahead. So this was the first green cemetery in Washtenaw County where I live, and it used to be the only until last year due to efforts of people in my area. There's now green burial in Dexter and Chelsea as well.
How much does it cost to have a green burial?
The cemetery charges what they want to for the plot. Sometimes they charge a little more for a green burial because they have to do that maintenance we talked about to keep the ground from.
Like at Waterford?
Yeah, I mean at Waterford it's I don't know $1,200 or something like that. I used to have some of the prices for the preserve. I think it could be up to $1,600.
Okay.
It kind of in line with the other plots in their cemetery. So this looks very different. This is the woman in the shroud that I told you about. That's the shroud, the son helping with the burial. I've been to graveside ceremonies where you can't even see the hole. That's more typical. There's AstroTurf and there's a machine and holding a casket, and it's kind of surreal. It's like we're not supposed to know what's going on here or something. This is very stark though, right? I mean, there's a hole. And they put the wood around the edge for stabilization, and then the family can participate in putting the dirt in afterwards. And this is what it looked like a few weeks later. So the grass was beginning to grow, and that's the rest of the conventional part of the cemetery in the distance. I went out there to meet with the board of the cemetery and a cemetery planner, landscape architect and stuff, just to talk about the logistics and how they made their decisions about what they allowed there. They will allow at this cemetery a natural marker, but not anything that has to be set in concrete. In Chelsea, they allow you to put in concrete for a marker, even though you don't have to have concrete for the grave liner itself. So they're still using some concrete. So let's see, somebody added one in Hebrew Memorial Cemetery is there, yeah. I think there's one in Roseville too, Oak Park and Roseville. And a lot of cemeteries will accommodate the Jewish tradition of not using the concrete grave liner, or they'll turn it upside down so you don't have to put the lid on so that it's in line with earth to earth, that the casket can go right on the ground, and then you still have the cement like on the top. So a lot of people have been doing a lot of ways to accommodate their religious needs for a long time. You were asking what motivated people for home funeral. I think it's a lot of the same reasons about what motivates people. We did a study in the Green Burial Council a few years ago, and minimal environmental impact was the top reason, but throwback to the old ways was the second one, wanting to do things in a more traditional way. And there's definitely a large do-it-yourself ethic going on there too. Okay, so this was a, remember that family with the guy with the military burial? That was the woman in the family's father. This is her husband's mother. They had a home funeral, and then they had a home burial as well for her in Manchester. So they built this casket from wood they had around on their farm, and they had been working with me on setting up this home cemetery for 3 years, and they still didn't have the paper because she was 100, and they knew it was coming, right? And they still didn't have all the paperwork ready, and it was Thanksgiving weekend when she died, and so the lawyer had to quick, hurry and try to get a hold of somebody at the county and push it through, and they were able to do it. So even with the best plans, we still put things off, don't we? that made quite a clunking sound with all those rocks when they were starting to fill it in. That was a little harsh. The ideal depth is not 6 feet, it's 4.5, it's probably 3.5 feet. You need 18 inches of soil on top of the container to provide a animal barrier, smell barrier. So this is what it looked like a while later, how they had sort of decorated it. And they plotted off an area that could hold maybe up to 60 graves or so. So far there's only been one burial there. But they, the daughter in the family, the one that didn't want her grandfather to have a home funeral, she ended up having a baby in the home. And right after the grandmother died, so they had home birth, home funeral, home burial, all kind of full circle. That's kind of my idea what I want, like a meadow with people, you mow a path to the grave and then you let it grow in, and then maybe engrave my name on like a cenotaph wall or something like that. You know, there's no need to be able to go there and visit the grave or anything. So I would like to know how I can be of service to you and to further your education, and just to let you know that I am available to travel and for consultation on home funeral and green burial. And I do educational presentations at libraries and senior centers and hospices and things like that, as well as talk to individual family members who are planning ahead. I also am a Respecting Choices First Steps facilitator trainer, so I come to organizations to teach. Who's heard of Respecting Choices? It's the probably one of the most well-known evidence-based advanced care planning platforms, where you work with people, the person and who they've designated to be their healthcare agent, to talk about their values and wishes in a way that increases the chances that they'll be followed for the kind of medical care that they want. So I do that. I host the Ann Arbor Death Cafe, which meets monthly and has been since 2012, and we're meeting tomorrow morning. So if anybody's still around and wants to come to Ann Arbor, we meet from 10:30 to 12:30 every third Saturday of the month. And it's an amazing experience. Now that it's been going for a long time, it's very multi-generational and very diverse now, whereas it used to be all middle-aged white women like myself. We now get up to 30, 35 people, and we start in small groups, and it's not facilitated. There's no agenda, there's no presentation, it's just people talking. And then we come together as a large group and we share out, and at the end we go around and we say a feeling word, how we're doing. And we do that because a lot of times you tell people you're going to go to Death Cafe and they're like, isn't that depressing or morbid, or why would you want to do that on a Saturday morning? But what people say about how they're feeling afterwards is, I feel inspired, connected, uplifted, informed, happy. It's very much about living your life better.
Who should go to one of those?
Anybody. It's mostly people like us, so healthcare providers, but just people. Like, not usually people who are sick and dying.
And it's not for people who are grieving?
No, it's not a grief support group, and we'd say that right in our blurb, yeah.
Where is it actually?
Where is it in Ann Arbor?
It's at Crazy Wisdom Bookstore on Main Street in Ann Arbor. Crazy, if you remember Crazy Wisdom, you can.
You said it's noon?
10:30 to 12:30.
Once a month?
Yes, on the third Saturday of the month. There is a wonderful website if you want to learn more about Death Cafe called deathcafe.com. And it's listed there, as well as all the death cafes that are happening all over the world. Death Cafe started in 2010 in France, in Paris, and then a man named John Underwood brought it to London in 2011, and when he was hosting the first one in his basement, his mother was a therapist, and he's like, Mom, I want you to help me. I'm going to come up with these questions that people need to answer, and blah, blah, blah. And she said, no, you don't need to do that. You provide a forum for people to get together. They will talk. They don't need any of that. And sure enough, that's what happened. So he created what's called a social franchise, where he has this website, and anybody who agrees to follow the guidelines can call it a death cafe. And the guidelines are that it's open and inclusive, and it's confidential, and it's free, and you don't try to sell anything, and you just let people talk. So we've been doing that. Actually, the Ann Arbor one that I started in November of 2012 is the longest standing one in the world, because we were the third one in the US, and we've been meeting monthly since then, so we've had 60 of them. So.
And clergy can go too?
Absolutely. We get a lot of social workers, people who work in end-of-life care, but mostly it's just people who, I've been getting a lot of college students lately. Well, with Facebook, they find out about it. In fact, the most interesting story was a couple years ago on St. Patrick's Day. It was a Saturday. A bunch of students came. They came late, so they were in my group because I take the latecomers. And I said, well, how did you guys hear about this? Oh, Facebook. And it's like, well, what led you to want to come? And they're like, because we're sober and all our friends are out getting drunk. And we wanted something really fun to do that wasn't about that. Like, right on. And they've come back, so that's pretty cool. So, yeah, there's a lot of events like that. There's you heard Dr. Eric talked about that, like death, dying, and dessert, death over dinner, death and dying dinner parties, stuff like that. A lot of those have structure to them and an assignment, and certain things you need to do. Death Cafe is the only one that's just super open like that.
People come with their spouses like date night?
They do. They absolutely do. Yep. Yeah, and so then I obviously also consult with people about home funeral and green burial. Other questions? We're about done? Yes.
So what's the environmental impact of the cremation process?
Thank you for asking that. So cremation requires the use of natural gas, about, I've been told, a tank and a half. And so a lot of people are opposed to that. And then the emissions from it there's not really any way to regulate that. I mean, there's minimal regulation of that, I should say. So it releases toxins, including mercury and stuff, into the air. So a lot of people feel like that's not very green. However, if the nearest green cemetery is 100 miles away and you got 50 people driving their cars there, that's not very green either. So I think it's just a matter of what's available in your area. Yeah, good question. Yes.
I have a question about the end-of-life doula.
End-of-life doula?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I didn't mention that. My main business is Lifespan Doula Association, where I train end-of-life doulas. Yeah.
How often are people taking that up? Because I know it's like I've been reading a lot about it.
Yeah.
And is it competitive with hospice? Is it?
No, and I'm glad you asked that, because it's not at all competitive. End-of-life doulas do not usurp the role of any caregiver. They are an added layer of support for families, and we all know that it's very overwhelming to be caring for somebody at home, and a lot of people don't know that hospice isn't there 24/7, and so they need extra support. So an end-of-life doula is a non-medical support person who can come in and do anything from helping them organize meals and visits and life review, legacy work, talking about what gives them meaning, having those conversations that they can be with people for a longer period of time than like a hospice volunteer or hospice person can. They're not perhaps doing anything different than a hospice person is, but it's more about having more time, because they're usually contracted directly by the family. My training is a 3-day intensive weekend training. I'm doing one in 2 weeks, and then if you want to become certified, that takes 6 months to 2 years after that, depending on how soon you get some experience.
What is the fee for that?
My training?
Consultation.
For
With a family, if a family.
For a family? So yeah, so there's no third-party reimbursement, so families are either paying out of pocket, or new end-of-life doulas are doing it as volunteer while they're learning, so that's providing a lot of care for the people who couldn't afford to pay. But it's similar to a birth or postpartum doula. The same model of care is that you're not telling people what to do, you're honoring where they're coming from and helping them become empowered to do what they need to do. And the fee structure would be similar as well, so either a per hour fee or a package.
And how much does the training cost?
$610 for the initial training. All right, well, it's been wonderful spending the afternoon with you, talking. Appreciate it very much. Take my flyer, it's back there, and follow up with me if you have any questions.